Hey guys, tonight we begin with a servant who gets dismissed for having dirt under his fingernails in the royal bedchamber, while another servant serves dinner in the great hall with hands covered in kitchen grease and nobody cares, which means cleanliness is measured differently depending on proximity to power, or cleanliness rules are about control rather than hygiene. This is about royal households in early Tudor England, those elaborate court systems where access to the king's bedchamber requires washing 3 times and changing into fresh clothing, while serving food in public halls requires nothing beyond not actively dripping filth onto the trenchers. It's not about dramatic poison plots or medical advances. It's about 1 year when a bedchamber servant realizes that the hygiene rules he enforces aren't protecting the king's health, but protecting the king's mystique, and what that realization reveals about how cleanliness becomes hierarchy, how proximity to power gets measured in hand-washing requirements, and how learning the difference between actual contamination and symbolic pollution is how you understand which bodies are considered dangerous and why.
Before we begin, let me ask something. If you're the kind of person who thinks about hygiene rules as social control, about how cleanliness standards reveal power structures, about the difference between protecting health and protecting hierarchy, you're in exactly the right place. Take a moment to subscribe to Quiet Manor Story if that sounds like you, and tell me in the comments about times you've seen hygiene requirements that seemed more about control than contamination. I'm genuinely curious who joins me for these explorations of how cleanliness becomes weapon. Now settle in, and let's discover what happens when a bedchamber servant counts the number of washings required in different palace spaces and realizes he's not preventing disease, but preventing wrong kinds of people from getting too close to royal body.
The palace is Hampton Court in London, and the year is 1527. Henry VIII is king, has been for 18 years, is 36 years old, and at height of his power. The court is elaborate, hundreds of servants, complex hierarchy, strict protocols about who can access which spaces and under what conditions. The bedchamber is innermost sanctum. Only select servants are allowed entry. They're called gentlemen of the bedchamber. Our focus is one of them. His name is Thomas Wardley. He's 28 years old and has held this position for 3 years. It's prestigious posting, signifies trust, requires absolute adherence to protocols that govern every aspect of how the bedchamber is maintained and who can enter it and under what conditions of cleanliness. The hygiene rules for bedchamber access are extensive. Thomas must wash his hands 3 times before entering, once in his own quarters with soap and water, once in the antechamber with rose water, once immediately outside the bedchamber door with perfumed water that's changed hourly. His clothing must be fresh, changed daily, inspected for stains or dirt before each shift. His fingernails must be clean, trimmed, free of any visible dirt or discoloration. His hair must be combed and covered. His face must be washed. His teeth must be cleaned with mint leaves. His breath must not smell of garlic or onions or strong cheese. He must smell of soap and rosewater and nothing else. Any deviation from these requirements results in dismissal from the bedchamber, immediate, permanent, no appeals. The hygiene standards are absolute because the bedchamber is sacred space where the king's body resides when vulnerable to contamination or attack. That's the official explanation. That's what Thomas was told when he received this appointment. That strict hygiene protects the king's health, prevents illness, maintains appropriate reverence for royal person. That's the reason. That's the justification. That's what Thomas believes for 3 years, until the day he realizes it's complete nonsense. The Great Hall is where public dining occurs, where the court assembles, where hundreds of people eat simultaneously. The hygiene rules for Great Hall service are minimal. Servants must not be actively filthy. That's it.
That's the standard. Don't track mud through the hall. Don't serve food with hands that are dripping with kitchen grease so conspicuously that nobles complain. Beyond that, nothing. No hand-washing requirements, no clothing inspections, no fingernail checks. Thomas observes kitchen servants serving dinner in the great hall with hands that are definitely not clean, with clothing that's stained and worn, with fingernails that have visible dirt. Nobody cares. Nobody enforces standards. The food goes from kitchen to table to mouths of nobles, and nobody worries about contamination, because the great hall isn't sacred space, isn't innermost sanctum, isn't where the king is vulnerable. The same nobles who eat food served by servants with dirty hands require absolute cleanliness from servants who enter bedchamber where the king sleeps. That discrepancy seems strange to Thomas, seems inconsistent if the purpose is protecting health. Why would contamination matter in bedroom but not dining hall? Why would dirty hands be dangerous when making bed but safe when serving food? The logic doesn't work unless the real purpose isn't health.
Thomas starts paying attention to hygiene rules across different palace spaces. The presence chamber, where the king receives visitors, requires moderate cleanliness. Servants must be presentable, clean enough to maintain dignity of royal presence, but not the extreme standards of bedchamber. No triple hand-washing, no perfumed water, no inspection of fingernails. Just general cleanliness appropriate to public space where nobles gather. The privy chamber, where the king conducts private business, requires higher standards. Not quite bedchamber level, but approaching it. Servants must wash hands twice, must wear fresh clothing, must be inspected before entry. The progression is clear. The closer you get to the king's body in its most private moments, the stricter the hygiene requirements. That makes sense if contamination is the concern. Except it doesn't, because contamination doesn't work that way. If dirty hands spread disease, they spread it whether touching bedroom linens or dinner plates. The location shouldn't matter. The contact matters. But the rules aren't about contact. They're about proximity, about how close you're allowed to get to royal person, about whether you're approaching the king when he's dressed and public or undressed and private. That's what the hygiene rules are measuring. Not cleanliness, not contamination, but intimacy, but access, but power.
Thomas realizes this on a Tuesday in March. He's enforcing bedchamber protocols as usual. A new servant arrives for training. Young man named Robert, who's been promoted to bedchamber service from serving in presence chamber. Robert arrives at the antechamber. Thomas inspects him. Robert's hands are clean. His clothing is fresh, but his fingernails have slight dirt under them, barely visible. You'd need to look closely to notice. Thomas notices, because noticing is his job. He tells Robert he can't enter the bedchamber, needs to clean his fingernails more thoroughly. Robert is confused. I cleaned them this morning. They're cleaner than they've ever been. Yesterday I served dinner in the presence chamber with hands far dirtier than this, and nobody said anything. Thomas explains that bedchamber standards are different, stricter, non-negotiable. Robert accepts this, but asks why. If my hands were clean enough to serve the king's dinner yesterday, why aren't they clean enough to change his bed linens today? Isn't food contamination more dangerous than touching sheets? Thomas doesn't have good answer. Explains that these are the rules, that bedchamber requires higher standards, that Robert needs to accept this if he wants to serve here. Robert cleans his fingernails again, returns, passes inspection, enters the bedchamber. But his question stays with Thomas. Why are hands that touch food held to lower standards than hands that touch linens? That's backwards if the goal is preventing illness. Food goes into the king's mouth. Linens just touch his skin. Direct contamination of food should be bigger concern than indirect contact with bedding, but the rules don't reflect that. The rules reflect something else, something about intimacy and access and proximity to vulnerable private royal body that has nothing to do with actual contamination risk.
If you're feeling that recognition of hygiene as control mechanism rather than health measure, of cleanliness rules as way to regulate proximity to power, that's exactly why I make these videos. The way contamination fears reveal hierarchies of access. Subscribe to Quiet Manor Story if you want to see how this understanding evolves across one transformative year.
and share your thoughts about modern hygiene theatre that's really about control. Thomas starts questioning other protocols. The rule about changing clothing daily before bedchamber entry. That's expensive. Requires servants to maintain multiple sets of clean clothing. Poor servants can't afford it. Means bedchamber service is limited to servants wealthy enough to meet hygiene requirements. That's class filter dressed as health measure. The rule about not smelling of garlic or onions. That's dietary restriction. Garlic and onions are poor people's food, cheap vegetables that flavour bland meals. Nobles eat them too, but prepared differently, with expensive spices that mask the smell. The rule effectively says poor people's food makes you unclean, that you can't serve in bedchamber if you eat like poor person. That's class hierarchy enforced through hygiene standards that declare certain smells polluting. The rule about washing with perfumed water. That's luxury requirement. Regular water cleans just as well. Perfumed water is expensive, signals status, says you're using costly resources just to wash hands. That's conspicuous consumption disguised as hygiene. All these rules are filters. They select for servants who are wealthy enough to afford multiple clean outfits, who eat foods nobles consider appropriate, who smell like nobles, who perform cleanliness as status marker rather than health practice. That's what bedchamber hygiene rules are doing. Selecting right kind of servants, not cleanest servants, right servants, ones who already signal noble status through their hygiene practices. The rules enforce hierarchy through declaring lower-class hygiene practices inadequate regardless of actual cleanliness. Thomas brings this up with senior gentleman of the bedchamber named Sir Edward. Sir Edward is 45 years old, has served in bedchamber for 15 years, understands protocols perfectly. Thomas asks carefully, "Sir Edward, I've noticed the hygiene standards in bedchamber are much stricter than in Great Hall. I understand maintaining higher standards in private chambers, but some requirements seem more about signalling status than preventing contamination. The perfumed water, for instance. Regular water cleans just as effectively. Why require expensive perfumed water if the goal is cleanliness?" Sir Edward looks at Thomas like he said something dangerous. The goal isn't just cleanliness, it's appropriate reverence. The king's body is sacred. Approaching it requires purification. The perfumed water signifies spiritual cleansing as much as physical cleaning. Do you understand? Thomas understands. Sir Edward just admitted the rules aren't about hygiene. They're about ritual, about signalling reverence, about performing purification that's spiritual, not practical. That's honest answer. Troubling answer, because if rules are ritual rather than hygiene, they're not protecting the king's health, they're protecting his mystique, his sacred status, his separation from common humanity. The rules create distance, enforce hierarchy, make approaching royal body feel like approaching altar. That's their purpose, not preventing disease, creating awe. Thomas accepts this explanation publicly, continues enforcing protocols, but privately he's unsettled. He's been treating hygiene rules as health measures, as reasonable precautions that protect the king from illness. Now he knows they're religious theatre, performance of purity that has nothing to do with actual contamination. He continues requiring triple hand washing and perfumed water and inspecting fingernails, but he knows he's not preventing disease. He's enforcing ritual, maintaining mystique, creating barriers between sacred royal body and profane servants who approach it. That's different job than he thought he had, different purpose, different meaning, and it changes how he understands every protocol he enforces. April. The king gets sick anyway, despite all the hygiene protocols. Despite triple hand washing and perfumed water and inspected fingernails and fresh clothing daily, Henry develops fever and cough. The bedchamber servants have maintained perfect hygiene for months, have followed every protocol, have purified themselves repeatedly, hasn't prevented illness, hasn't protected the king, because the hygiene rules were never about prevention, were always about performance, about ritual,
about creating illusion of control over royal health through elaborate cleaning ceremonies that feel protective but don't actually prevent anything. Thomas continues his duties while the king is sick, continues washing 3 times, continues using perfumed water, continues inspecting fingernails. All of it feels absurd now, feels like performance without purpose, like ritual that's revealed as ineffective by reality of king lying feverish despite all the purification that was supposed to protect him. But nobody changes the protocols. Nobody admits they didn't work, because they were never designed to work, were designed to signify, to perform, to create reverence. They're doing that fine, even while the king is sick. The mystique is maintained. The separation is enforced. The ritual continues. That's all that matters. Not actual health, just continued performance of sacred distance between king and servants who tend him.
The king recovers after 10 days. Nobody credits hygiene protocols. Nobody analyzes what went wrong. The protocols continue unchanged because their failure doesn't matter. They're not measured by effectiveness. They're measured by consistency, by whether they're maintained regardless of results. Thomas understands this now, understands that he's not protecting the king. He's maintaining system, performing rituals, enforcing separation, creating practical barriers through hygiene requirements that keep wrong people away from royal body. Not wrong because they're dirty, wrong because they're poor, or smell like garlic, or can't afford multiple changes of clothing. The hygiene rules are class filters. The hand-washing is ritual performance. The whole system is designed to maintain hierarchy through declaring certain people inherently unclean, regardless of actual cleanliness. That's what Thomas enforces. That's his job, not protection, exclusion, not hygiene, hierarchy, not health, theatre. He continues doing it because it's his position, but he knows what he's doing now, knows what the rules mean, knows that every time he inspects fingernails or requires perfumed water or dismisses servant for inadequate cleanliness, he's not preventing contamination, he's enforcing boundaries, declaring who's pure enough to approach power, maintaining mystique through ritual cleansing that signifies status, not sanication.
May brings new servant to bedchamber service, young woman named Margaret, who's been promoted from serving in Queen's chambers. She's competent, diligent, eager to prove herself. Promise trains her in hygiene protocols, shows her the triple hand-washing routine, the perfumed water stations, the clothing inspection process, the fingernail standards. Margaret absorbs everything, then asks question that Thomas doesn't expect. These rules seem designed to make bedchamber service impossible for most servants. The clothing requirements alone would bankrupt anyone earning standard wages. Are we selecting for cleanliness or wealth? Thomas is caught. She's noticed immediately what took him 3 years to recognize, that the hygiene rules are class filters. He gives official answer. We're selecting for people who take cleanliness seriously enough to invest in appropriate materials. Margaret isn't satisfied. But that's circular reasoning. You're saying only people who can afford expensive hygiene practices are clean enough to serve. That's not about actual cleanliness. That's about economic exclusion dressed as hygiene standard. She's exactly right. Thomas can't argue, can only say that these are the protocols, that she needs to follow them, that questioning them isn't productive. Margaret accepts this for now, but Thomas knows she's going to keep questioning, keep noticing, keep pointing out inconsistencies. She's seeing through the performance already. That's dangerous awareness. Makes it hard to maintain the rituals with straight face. Makes the whole system feel more absurd when someone explicitly names what it's doing.
Thomas continues enforcing protocols through summer. The triple hand-washing, the perfumed water, the fingernail inspections, the clothing checks. But he's more aware now, more conscious of what he's doing, more troubled by the absurdity. A servant gets dismissed in June for having rough hands.
Not dirty hands, rough hands, calloused from labour. The dismissed servant is a poor man who worked his way up from stable service. His hands are clean, scrubbed carefully, but they're workers' hands, rough, calloused, evidence of manual labour. That's enough for dismissal. Gentlemen of the bedchamber must have appropriate hands, the steward explains. Rough hands suggest inappropriate background. The king deserves to be served by people whose very bodies reflect appropriate status. Thomas understands. The hygiene rules extend beyond cleanliness to body itself. Poor people's bodies are wrong, marked by labour, calloused, rough, inappropriate for bedchamber, regardless of cleanliness. That's explicit class exclusion. Not even pretending to be about hygiene anymore, just declaring that certain bodies are inherently unsuitable, that poverty leaves marks that no amount of washing can remove, that you can't be pure enough for bedchamber service if your hands remember labour. That's what Thomas enforces. That's the system. That's the hierarchy, made visible through hygiene protocols that aren't about hygiene at all.
Margaret notices this dismissal, asks Thomas about it. His hands were clean. I watched him wash. He followed every protocol. Why was he dismissed? Thomas explains that rough hands suggest inappropriate background. Margaret is incredulous. So the rules aren't about being clean. They're about having hands that have never done real work. That's not hygiene. That's aristocracy. You're enforcing class boundaries, not contamination prevention. Thomas can't disagree, can only say that's how the system works, that bedchamber service is for people whose bodies demonstrate appropriate status. That includes having hands that show you've never had to do heavy labour, that poverty disqualifies you regardless of cleanliness. Margaret looks disgusted. That's evil. You're saying poor people are inherently polluting, that their bodies are wrong, that no amount of washing makes them suitable. That's not about the king's health. That's about maintaining rigid class separation through declaring entire classes of people contaminating. She's absolutely right. Thomas knows it. The hygiene rules are about class, not cleanliness, about maintaining aristocratic exclusivity around royal body, about ensuring only right kind of people get close to power, about declaring wrong people inherently polluting, regardless of actual hygiene. That's the system. That's what Thomas maintains. That's what he keeps enforcing, even while knowing it's fundamentally unjust, because this is his position, and he has no power to change it, and questioning it too loudly would cost him everything.
August. Thomas has been questioning protocols for 6 months, has been increasingly troubled by their purpose, has been recognizing that his job isn't protecting the king, but maintaining hierarchy through hygiene theatre. He continues performing duties, continues enforcing standards. But something has shifted. He's less rigorous, lets minor violations pass, doesn't inspect quite as carefully, starts treating protocols as guidelines rather than absolute requirements. Margaret notices, approves, starts relaxing her enforcement too. They don't discuss it explicitly, just quietly agree to be less strict, to focus on actual cleanliness rather than ritual performance, to allow servants who are genuinely clean even if they don't perfectly meet class-based standards. It's small rebellion, quiet subversion. Nobody notices at first. The bedchamber continues functioning. The king is served appropriately. The only difference is that Thomas and Margaret are interpreting hygiene rules as health measures rather than class filters, are allowing people with rough hands if those hands are clean, are accepting servants who smell slightly of garlic if they've washed carefully, are prioritizing actual contamination prevention over ritual purification. It's subtle, it's quiet, it's their small resistance to a system they're required to maintain.
Then Sir Edward notices, observes Thomas allowing servant with questionable fingernails into the bedchamber. Servant's hands are clean, nails are trimmed, but there's slight discoloration, not dirt, just natural discoloration from age or work. Sir Edward would have dismissed this servant. Thomas allowed entry. Sir Edward calls Thomas aside after the shift. You're being lax. The standards exist for reason.
Every relaxation of protocol weakens the system. Every servant allowed in with less than perfect presentation degrades the sacred nature of bedchamber service. You need to enforce protocols strictly, absolutely, without exception. That's your job. Thomas knows this is coming, has prepared response. I am enforcing protocols strictly, Sir Edward. I am enforcing hygiene, actual cleanliness. That servant's hands were clean. The discoloration wasn't dirt, was natural marking, doesn't indicate contamination. I'm protecting the king's health. Isn't that our purpose? Sir Edward stares at him. Our purpose is maintaining appropriate reverence, appropriate separation, appropriate exclusivity. If you don't understand that, you don't understand this position. Thomas understands perfectly, understands that Sir Edward just admitted the protocols aren't about health, are about maintaining aristocratic exclusivity through hygiene theatre. But admitting he understands means admitting he's been deliberately subverting that purpose. Better to maintain position that he's enforcing health standards and let Sir Edward think he's stupid rather than rebellious. I'll be more careful, Thomas says carefully, returns to duties, knowing that his quiet rebellion has been noticed, that he needs to be more careful or more committed. Either enforce protocols strictly as designed or openly admit he's subverting them and face consequences. There's no middle ground anymore. Sir Edward is watching. Thomas has to choose.
September. Thomas chooses commitment. Chooses to continue interpreting hygiene protocols as health measures rather than class filters. Chooses to prioritize actual cleanliness over ritual purification. Chooses subversion, despite Sir Edward's warning. Margaret supports this choice. They coordinate their enforcement, develop shared understanding of what counts as genuinely clean versus what counts as appropriately aristocratic. They allow servants with rough hands if those hands are scrubbed carefully. They allow servants who smell slightly of normal food if they've washed thoroughly. They inspect for actual dirt, not for signs of poverty. They enforce hygiene, not hierarchy. It's deliberate now, not just casual relaxation, but conscious policy. They've decided the protocols as designed are unjust. They're reinterpreting them to serve what they believe is actual purpose, protecting the king's health, rather than official purpose of maintaining class separation. That's rebellion. Quiet rebellion. Invisible rebellion, unless you're looking for it, but rebellion nonetheless.
Sir Edward is looking for it. He's watching Thomas and Margaret carefully. Notices the pattern of their enforcement. Notices they're allowing servants he would have dismissed. Notices they're interpreting standards flexibly. In October, he brings formal complaint to the Lord Chamberlain, who oversees all household positions. Thomas Wardley and Margaret Somerset are failing to maintain proper standards in bedchamber service. They're allowing inappropriate servants into royal chambers. They're relaxing hygiene protocols. They're prioritizing their personal judgment over established procedures. This endangers the king and degrades the sacred nature of bedchamber service. That's serious accusation. Questions their competence, questions their loyalty, questions their fitness for positions of trust. The Lord Chamberlain investigates, interviews Thomas. Sir Edward claims you're relaxing hygiene standards, that you're allowed servants with questionable cleanliness into the bedchamber. Is this accurate? Thomas has a prepared answer, has rehearsed it, has decided what line to take. I enforce hygiene standards strictly, my lord. I inspect every servant carefully. I require thorough washing and appropriate presentation. If Sir Edward and I disagree about specific cases, it's because we interpret cleanliness differently. I focus on actual contamination. Sir Edward focuses on other factors. But I assure you, I never allow genuinely dirty servants into the bedchamber. Every person I admit is clean by any reasonable health standard.
The Lord Chamberlain considers this, asks for specific examples. Thomas provides them. The servant with rough hands whose hands were nevertheless scrubbed clean. The servant with slight garlic smell who had washed thoroughly but eaten garlic bread at breakfast. The servant with natural nail discoloration that wasn't dirt. In each case, Thomas argues, the servant was hygienically clean, just not aristocratically pure. The Lord Chamberlain nods slowly. So you're saying Sir Edward enforces social standards, while you enforce health standards. That Sir Edward is concerned with maintaining appropriate exclusivity, while you're concerned with preventing contamination. Is that accurate characterization? Thomas knows this is a trap. Admitting this means admitting he's subverting official purpose of protocols, but denying it means claiming Sir Edward is wrong about his own stated priorities. Thomas chooses honesty. I believe the bedchamber protocols should primarily serve the king's health. If they also serve social functions, those functions should be secondary to actual hygiene. But I understand that's my interpretation, and others may disagree. The Lord Chamberlain dismisses him, doesn't indicate which interpretation he accepts. Thomas leaves knowing his position is endangered, knowing his honesty might cost him everything, knowing he's forced the court to explicitly choose between health and hierarchy as primary purpose of hygiene protocols. If you're recognizing that impossible position of having to choose between doing your job well versus doing it according to unjust rules, between actual purpose versus official purpose, that's exactly why I make these videos. The way systems force servants to choose between competence and compliance. Subscribe to Quiet Manor Story if you want to see how this confrontation escalates, and share your experiences with being punished for doing the right thing in wrong way. The Lord Chamberlain's decision comes 3 days later. Thomas and Margaret are both retained in their positions, but new directive is issued. Hygiene protocols in royal bedchamber serve multiple purposes. Protecting the king's health is primary purpose. Maintaining appropriate reverence and exclusivity are secondary purposes. Both must be balanced. Gentlemen of the bedchamber should enforce standards that achieve both purposes. When health and reverence conflict, err on side of health. When both can be maintained, maintain both. Flexibility in interpretation is acceptable when actual cleanliness is assured. Rigid adherence to class-based standards at expense of practical hygiene is inappropriate. Its partial victory for Thomas's interpretation acknowledges that health should be primary, allows flexibility, but also maintains that class-based standards have legitimate role. That's a compromise. Imperfect, but better than absolute enforcement of hierarchy over health. Sir Edward is furious, feels his authority has been undermined, feels the sacred nature of bedchamber has been degraded, complains loudly to anyone who listen that standards are slipping, that inappropriate servants are approaching royal body, that catastrophe will result from this relaxation of proper protocols. Nobody listens to him with much sympathy. The Lord Chamberlain's directive is clear. Sir Edward's interpretation is no longer absolute standard. Thomas and Margaret have successfully challenged it. Small victory. Doesn't change system fundamentally, just creates space for more flexible interpretation. Just acknowledges that hygiene protocols should primarily serve health. That's progress. Slight progress, but progress nonetheless. The effects are gradual. Thomas and Margaret continue interpreting protocols flexibly. Other bedchamber servants notice the shift, start following their lead, start focusing on actual cleanliness rather than class markers, start allowing servants who would previously have been excluded. The bedchamber service becomes slightly less aristocratic, slightly more meritocratic. People with rough hands are allowed if they maintain genuine cleanliness. People who smell of garlic are accepted if they've washed thoroughly. People with visible signs of labor are tolerated if they perform their duties competently. The change is subtle, wouldn't be obvious to casual observer, but it's real. The bedchamber service is slowly transforming from exclusive aristocratic ritual to functional hygiene practice. That's what Thomas and Margaret have accomplished. Not revolution, just incremental reform, just gradual shift from hierarchy to health as primary organizing principle. That's all they could achieve given their positions. That's significant achievement nonetheless.
November. New crisis emerges. Different kind of threat. The king wants to visit Common Tavern incognito, wants to experience London nightlife without royal protocol. It's dangerous politically, dangerous physically, but the king is determined. The bedchamber servants are required to facilitate this visit while maintaining security. That includes managing hygiene. Thomas and Margaret are assigned to prepare the king for this excursion. They need to make him look common. That means deliberately violating all the hygiene standards they've been enforcing. They need to make the king's smell less aristocratic. Dress him in clothing that's worn, not fresh. Make him look like he hasn't bathed in perfumed water. Make him appear ordinary. That's reverse hygiene protocol. Instead of purifying servants to approach sacred royal body, they're profaning royal body to approach common environment. The irony isn't lost on Thomas. He spent 3 years enforcing strict cleanliness standards. Now he's being told to make the king intentionally less clean to facilitate his tavern visit. That reveals everything about what hygiene protocols really mean. They're not about actual cleanliness. They're about maintaining appropriate appearance for your social position. The king needs to be elaborately clean when being king, needs to be less clean when pretending to be common. Cleanliness is costume, performance of status, not health practice, but identity marker. Thomas understands this fully now.
They prepare the king for his tavern visit. Skip the perfumed water, skip the fresh clothing, use worn garments that smell like ordinary life. Don't mask the king's natural scent with roses and lavender. Let him smell human. Let him look like someone who works. Let him appear unpurified. It feels transgressive, feels like they're violating sacred protocols. But the king orders it, demands it, insists on appearing common for his entertainment. So Thomas performs a reverse purification ritual, makes the king less aristocratically clean, more authentically human, more genuinely dirty by court standards, even though he's still cleaner than most actual common people. The whole process reveals how arbitrary the hygiene standards are, how they're about signifying status, not preventing contamination, how the same body can be appropriately clean or inappropriately dirty, depending entirely on social context rather than actual hygiene state. Thomas is performing this contradiction, making it visible, demonstrating through his actions that cleanliness is pure social construct, having nothing to do with health.
The tavern visit proceeds. The king enjoys himself, returns to palace, requires immediate re-purification. Thomas must now reverse the reverse purification, must restore the king to appropriately aristocratic cleanliness. Triple washing with perfumed water, fresh, elaborate clothing, removal of all traces of common environment, restoration of sacred separation between royal body and ordinary world. Thomas performs this ritual knowing it's theatre, knowing the king's body isn't actually contaminated by tavern visit, knowing the purification doesn't protect health, it protects mystique, it re-establishes hierarchy, it signals that the king has returned to his proper elevated status. That's what the washing means, not cleaning, but re-sanctifying, not hygiene, but ritual restoration of social order. Thomas performs it mechanically, goes through motions, maintains appropriate reverence, but internally he's laughing at the absurdity, at how seriously everyone treats this performance of purity that means nothing except what it signals about social position.
Margaret asks him afterwards about the experience. Does it bother you that we deliberately made the king less clean for his entertainment and then immediately re-purified him, not for health, but for status? Thomas considers. It bothers me that everyone pretends this is about contamination, that we maintain elaborate fiction that hygiene protocols protect health when they're really just status markers. If we admitted honestly that the washing and the perfumed water and the fresh clothing are ritual performances of social hierarchy, that would be fine. Rituals are fine. But pretending they're health measures, enforcing them as if they prevent disease, dismissing servants for violations that have nothing to do with actual cleanliness, that's what bothers me. The dishonesty, the pretense, the cruelty of enforcing false standards as if they were legitimate hygiene requirements. Margaret agrees. They've both reached same understanding. The hygiene protocols aren't evil in themselves. Rituals that signify status are normal part of social organization. What's evil is pretending they're about health, using false health justifications to enforce class exclusion, dismissing poor servants for failing standards that have nothing to do with actual contamination. That's the injustice. That's what they're resisting. Not the protocols themselves, but the dishonest justifications for them. If the court admitted honestly that bedchamber service is restricted to aristocrats because they want aristocratic exclusivity, Thomas and Margaret would have less problem with it. It's the pretense that exclusion is about cleanliness that they find intolerable. The use of hygiene as excuse for class discrimination.
December. Sir Edward makes final attempt to restore strict enforcement. He proposes new protocol. All bedchamber servants must undergo monthly medical examination by court physician. The physician will assess their cleanliness according to humoral theory, will determine if their bodily humours are appropriately balanced, will identify servants whose inherent constitutions make them unsuitable for royal service. It's medical justification for class exclusion. Gives physician authority to dismiss servants based on supposed humoral imbalances that correlate suspiciously with class markers. Poor diet creates imbalances. Physical labour creates imbalances. Poverty shows up in the body as humoral disorder that physician can diagnose and use to justify exclusion. It's perfect system for Sir Edward, using medical authority to enforce class boundaries, makes exclusion seem scientific rather than social. Thomas and Margaret oppose this, argue that humoral assessments are subjective, that physicians' judgments reflect social biases, that this would give arbitrary power to dismiss servants based on class prejudice disguised as medical diagnosis. The Lord Chamberlain considers both sides, ultimately rejects Sir Edward's proposal. Hygiene protocols are sufficient. We don't need medical examinations to determine suitability. Servants who maintain actual cleanliness and perform duties competently are suitable, regardless of their humoral constitution. Sir Edward's proposal is denied. That's another victory for health over hierarchy, another rejection of using false medical justifications for class discrimination. Sir Edward is defeated. His vision of bedchamber as exclusively aristocratic sacred space, protected by elaborate purification rituals that exclude wrong classes, has been rejected in favour of Thomas and Margaret's vision of bedchamber as protected by actual hygiene practices that focus on real contamination rather than class markers. The shift is significant. Changes have
Bedchamber service operates, changes who can serve, changes what protocols mean.
January 1528. Thomas has been gentleman of the bedchamber for 4 years, has spent last year completely transforming his understanding of what that position means, has gone from unquestioning enforcer of hygiene theatre to conscious resistor of class-based purification rituals, has successfully advocated for interpreting protocols as health measures rather than status performances, has changed how bedchamber service operates, hasn't eliminated all class-based restrictions. The bedchamber is still exclusive, still limited to trusted servants, still operates according to protocols that signify reverence. But the pretense that exclusivity is about contamination has been weakened. The acknowledgement that health should be primary concern has been established. The allowance for flexible interpretation based on actual cleanliness rather than class markers has been won. These are modest reforms, don't fundamentally challenge hierarchy, don't redistribute power, don't democratize access to royal body. Just make hygiene protocols slightly more honest, slightly more focused on actual health, slightly less cruel in their enforcement. That's all Thomas could achieve. He accepts that it's insufficient, also values that it's something. Small resistance sometimes produces small results. That's better than no resistance producing no results. Thomas is satisfied with having nudged the system toward greater honesty about its purposes and greater flexibility in its enforcement. That's what 4 years of questioning and 1 year of active resistance accomplished. Not revolution, just slight improvement. Just marginally more justice. That's worth something.
A new servant arrives in February. Young man named William from minor gentry family. He's wealthy enough to afford multiple changes of clothing, refined enough to avoid garlic, aristocratic enough to have soft hands. He'd pass Sir Edward's standards perfectly. Thomas trains him anyway in actual hygiene practices, shows him the triple washing, explains why each step matters for contamination prevention, teaches him to inspect his own hands for actual dirt, not for signs of labour, trains him to understand protocols as health measures rather than as performances of purity. William is confused, but I thought the protocols were about showing reverence, about maintaining sacred separation, about signifying appropriate status through elaborate cleansing rituals. Thomas nods. That's what Sir Edward taught. That's what the protocols originally meant. But we've reinterpreted them. We enforce them primarily as health measures now. The reverence and the separation still matter, but they're secondary to actual cleanliness. If you can't maintain both, choose health over hierarchy. That's current standard. William looks uncertain, but accepts this training. Thomas has successfully transmitted his reformed interpretation to new generation, has taught someone from aristocratic background to value health over class exclusivity in applying hygiene protocols. That's cultural change. Small cultural change. Won't survive if Thomas leaves his position. Will disappear if Sir Edward regains control, but exists currently shapes how Bedchamber operates, currently makes service slightly less exclusionary, currently treats hygiene as health measure rather than pure status performance. That's Thomas's legacy. Temporary, fragile, insufficient legacy, but legacy nonetheless.
March brings news that complicates everything. The king is considering divorce from Queen Catherine, wants to marry Anne Boleyn, needs Pope's approval. Political crisis is developing. The entire court is consumed by succession drama. In this chaos, hygiene protocols are forgotten. Nobody cares about hand-washing standards when throne succession is being disputed. The elaborate attention to purification rituals fades. Bedchamber service becomes more practical, less theatrical. The crisis accidentally accomplishes what Thomas couldn't achieve deliberately, makes hygiene about function, not performance, makes protocols about getting work done rather than maintaining mystique. Thomas continues enforcing reasonable cleanliness standards, but stops worrying about class markers. Nobody's paying attention anyway. Everyone's focused on political maneuvering. The bedchamber servants just need to maintain basic functionality while court tears itself apart over royal marriage. That's what crisis does. Strips away the theatre, reveals what's essential versus what's performance. In normal times, the purification rituals seem important. In crisis, they're irrelevant. Only actual hygiene matters, only preventing actual contamination. The status performances disappear as unnecessary luxuries. Thomas finds this clarifying, finds that stripping away the ritual reveals how little of the protocol was ever about health, how much was pure theatre. Crisis makes that obvious, makes everyone admit implicitly that the elaborate cleansing ceremonies weren't essential, were just status displays, could be abandoned without consequence when other matters demanded attention. That admission has been Thomas's goal for years. Crisis achieves it accidentally, makes his point better than he could argue it, shows that hygiene protocols can focus purely on health without all the class-based purification ritual, and everything works fine, actually works better, because servants can focus on actual contamination.
Without worrying about performing appropriate reverence. The political crisis over the king's divorce continues through 1528 and into 1529. The court remains in chaos. The bedchamber service operates with minimal protocol enforcement. The elaborate hygiene rituals are mostly abandoned. Servants wash their hands adequately and perform their duties competently. Nobody worries about perfumed water or triple washing or fingernail inspections. The system works fine. The king is served appropriately. Nothing bad happens from relaxing the protocols. No illness, no contamination, no catastrophe. Just normal functioning bedchamber service without the theatre of purification. That's the lesson. That's what the crisis teaches. That the elaborate protocols were never necessary. were always pure performance, could be stripped away without consequence. Thomas watches this lesson unfold, watches the court accidentally prove his argument, watches everyone implicitly admit that hygiene theatre was just theatre by abandoning it when distracted by actual important matters. That admission can't be unsaid, can't be reversed once crisis ends. The court has shown that elaborate purification rituals aren't essential to bedchamber function. That knowledge changes everything going forward.
Thank you for staying with this difficult exploration of how hygiene becomes hierarchy, how cleanliness rules enforce class boundaries, how protocols that claim to protect health actually protect power structures. If this changed how you think about hygiene requirements, about who gets labeled clean versus dirty, about how contamination fears get weaponized, subscribe to Quiet Manor Story and share your thoughts. Where do you see hygiene theatre in modern institutions? How do cleanliness standards explain? Thank you for staying with this difficult exploration of how hygiene becomes hierarchy, how cleanliness rules enforce class boundaries, how protocols that claim to protect health actually protect power structures. If this changed how you think about hygiene requirements, about who gets labeled clean versus dirty, about how contamination fears get weaponized, subscribe to Quiet Manor Story and share your thoughts. Where do you see hygiene theatre in modern institutions? How do cleanliness standards exclude people? How do we distinguish real health measures from status performances? I genuinely want to hear your reflections.
May 1529. The crisis is resolving slowly. The king is moving toward break with Rome, will establish Church of England with himself as head. This allows divorce without papal approval. Political manoeuvring is intense, but attention is gradually returning to normal court functions, including bedchamber protocols. Sir Edward attempts to restore strict enforcement, proposes return to full hygiene rituals, triple washing, perfumed water, fingernail inspections, all the elaborate procedures that were abandoned during crisis. Thomas opposes this, points out that bedchamber functioned perfectly well with relaxed standards for past year, that no health problems resulted, that servants maintained adequate cleanliness without elaborate rituals, that restoring full protocols would be returning to pure theatre. The Lord Chamberlain is persuaded, issues new directive. Bedchamber protocols have been simplified during recent political crisis. The simplified protocols proved adequate for protecting the king's health while allowing servants to focus on essential duties. The court will maintain simplified protocols going forward. Servants must wash hands thoroughly before entering bedchamber, must wear clean clothing appropriate to their duties, must maintain general cleanliness suitable for royal service. Beyond these basic requirements, elaborate purification rituals are discontinued as unnecessary. The bedchamber will operate according to practical hygiene standards rather than symbolic purification ceremonies. That's complete victory for Thomas's interpretation, not just allowing flexible interpretation, but officially abandoning the elaborate rituals, replacing them with basic practical hygiene requirements, acknowledging explicitly that previous protocols were excessive, that simpler standards are sufficient. That's formal recognition that hygiene theatre was just theatre. That's institutional change. That's what Thomas spent 2 years working toward. Complete reform of how
bedchamber hygiene is conceptualized and enforced.
Sir Edward is devastated, sees this as degradation of sacred office, as profaning royal bedchamber, as eliminating appropriate reverence. He resigns his position rather than serve under simplified protocols, leaves court entirely, returns to his estate. Thomas becomes senior gentleman of the bedchamber by default. He's now responsible for setting standards and training new servants. He uses this authority to institutionalize health-based interpretation of hygiene, train servants to focus on actual contamination, to distinguish between dirt that poses health risks and markers of social status, to enforce cleanliness without enforcing class exclusivity, to treat hygiene as practical health measure rather than as performance of hierarchy. That's Thomas's institutional legacy, not just reforming protocols, but training generation of servants who understand them differently, who see hygiene as function, not theatre, who enforce standards that protect health rather than maintain mystique. That cultural change persists beyond Thomas's tenure, becomes how bedchamber service operates, becomes normal, becomes accepted wisdom that hygiene is about cleanliness, not class. That's deeper victory than policy change alone would be. That's changing how people think about the subject, how they understand what hygiene means, what its purposes are, what standards serve. That's cultural transformation, small but real, limited but significant. Thomas accomplishes this through 5 years of questioning, 2 years of resistance, and 2 years of institutional authority to implement reformed vision. That's his achievement, reforming how one institution understands hygiene, making it slightly more just, slightly more honest, slightly more focused on health than hierarchy.
Other courts notice the change. Other royal households traditionally maintained similar elaborate purification protocols. Hampton Court's abandonment of these rituals is noted. Some courts follow suit, simplify their own hygiene requirements, acknowledge that elaborate ceremonies were unnecessary. Other courts maintain traditional protocols but feel defensive about them, feel need to justify maintaining rituals that Hampton Court abandoned, feel pressure to explain why their purification requirements are necessary when England's royal court manages with simpler standards. Thomas's reforms ripple outward, not dramatically, not quickly, but gradually other institutions start questioning whether their hygiene protocols are actually about health or are just inherited traditions that serve social purposes. Some abandon elaborate requirements, some maintain them but acknowledge they're ritual rather than medical. That acknowledgement matters, makes it harder to enforce class-based purification standards while claiming their health measures, makes courts more honest about what their protocols mean. That honesty is progress. Not perfect, not complete, but movement toward less cruel enforcement of class boundaries through false hygiene justifications. Thomas's reforms at Hampton Court contribute to that broader movement by providing example of how protocols can be simplified without negative health consequences. That example gives ammunition to reformers elsewhere, gives evidence that elaborate rituals aren't necessary, that practical hygiene works fine. That's how institutional change spreads. One example influences others, one reform enables others. Thomas's work at Hampton Court matters beyond Hampton Court, influences how other courts think about hygiene, contributes to gradual cultural shift toward more honest understanding of what cleanliness rules mean and serve.
1532. Thomas is 33 years old, has been senior gentleman of the bedchamber for 3 years, has successfully maintained simplified hygiene protocols, has trained 20 new servants in health-based interpretation of cleanliness requirements. The bedchamber operates efficiently. The king is served well. Nobody misses elaborate purification rituals. Nobody claims the simplified standards are inadequate. The system works. That's the final proof. That simplified protocols focused on actual health rather than symbolic purification can maintain royal bedchamber perfectly well, can provide appropriate service, can protect against real contamination, can do everything the elaborate protocols claimed to do except perform class hierarchy. That last part is what's lost. The symbolic separation, the mystification of royal body, the enforcement of aristocratic exclusivity through purification requirements. Those are gone. The bedchamber is still restricted, still limited to trusted servants, still operates according to standards of reverence, but the hygiene protocols no longer serve primarily to exclude wrong kinds of people, no longer dismiss servants for having rough hands or smelling of garlic, no longer enforce class boundaries through false health justifications. That's what Thomas eliminated. That's what's different. The bedchamber is slightly more meritocratic, slightly more focused on competence than birth, slightly less cruel in how it determines who's suitable for service. That's insufficient progress, doesn't eliminate hierarchy, doesn't democratize access to power, doesn't challenge fundamental structure of court that concentrates authority around king's body, but it makes that structure slightly less dishonest, slightly less brutal, slightly more focused on function than theatre. That's worth something.
Thomas reflects on what he's accomplished. Spent 5 years questioning protocols he was supposed to enforce unquestioningly. Discovered that hygiene rules were really class filters disguised as health measures. Realized that purification rituals were about maintaining mystique, not preventing contamination. Decided to resist this dishonesty through reinterpreting protocols as actual health standards. Advocated successfully for flexible interpretation that prioritized cleanliness over class markers. Won institutional support for simplified protocols during political crisis. Became senior servant and institutionalized health-based interpretation. Trained a generation of servants to understand hygiene differently. Influenced other courts to question their own elaborate protocols. That's substantial achievement for someone in servant position with limited power. Didn't change world, didn't overthrow hierarchy, just reformed one institution's understanding of what hygiene means and serves. Made that institution slightly more just, slightly more honest. That's all Thomas could do from his position. That's more than most people in similar positions accomplish. He's satisfied with having done what he could, with having resisted dishonesty successfully, with having made systems slightly better for people who come after him. That satisfaction sustains him, makes his service meaningful, makes his position something other than pure complicity. He enforced unjust protocols for 3 years before understanding what they meant, then spent 5 years reforming them once he understood. That ratio feels acceptable. Took time to recognize injustice, then acted to reduce it once recognized. That's normal human pattern. That's forgivable. That's worth respecting. Thomas respects himself for this journey, for the questioning and the resistance and the reform, for using his position to make small positive change, for being person who challenged system he was part of, rather than person who
unquestioningly maintained it.
Margaret continues working alongside Thomas. She's also risen in hierarchy, is now senior bedchamber servant in Queen's service. Anne Boleyn is Queen now, Henry having finally achieved his divorce and remarriage. Margaret applies same principles in Queen's chambers that Thomas applies in King's chambers, focuses on actual cleanliness rather than class performance, trains servants to understand hygiene as health measure, creates parallel reform. Between them, Thomas and Margaret have transformed how bedchamber service operates in both royal chambers, have established new culture around cleanliness that's more honest and more just than what existed before. That's their combined achievement, supporting each other, coordinating their resistance, succeeding together in reforming system they couldn't have changed individually. That partnership matters. That's how institutional change happens. Multiple people in similar positions, recognizing similar problems and coordinating similar reforms. Not dramatic revolution, but quiet, persistent pressure from people inside system who see its flaws and work to fix them incrementally. Thomas and Margaret are those people. Their success demonstrates that servants aren't powerless, that even people in subordinate positions can influence how institutions operate, that questioning and resistance and strategic advocacy can produce change. Small change, incremental change, but real change that makes system function more justly. That lesson matters beyond their specific reforms, matters for anyone working within unjust institutions, shows that change is possible, that individuals can matter, that persistence and strategy and coordination can overcome resistance from defenders of status quo. That's hopeful message. That's what Thomas and Margaret's story teaches.
But the limits matter too. Thomas couldn't eliminate hierarchy, couldn't make bedchamber service fully meritocratic, couldn't challenge fundamental structure of court that privileges nobles over servants, could only reform hygiene protocols, could only make those specific rules slightly less unjust. The broader hierarchy persists. The king still has absolute power. Nobles still dominate court. Servants still serve at pleasure of superiors. That structure is unchanged. Thomas's reforms operate within it, accept it, work around its edges, make it function slightly better without challenging its existence. That's the limit of what Thomas could accomplish from his position. That's what servants can do. Reform specific practices, challenge specific injustices, make specific improvements,
can't overthrow the system, can't redistribute power fundamentally, can only make existing system operate more justly in specific limited ways. Thomas accepts these limits, accepts that his reforms are insufficient, accepts that hierarchy will persist beyond his service, accepts that future servants will face different injustices that need different reforms. He's done what he could about hygiene protocols. Others will need to address other problems. That's how progress works when individuals have limited power. Each person addresses what they can from their position. Accumulation of small reforms gradually makes system better. Not perfect, not just, but better than it was. That's achievable. That's worth pursuing. That's what Thomas pursued successfully. That's his legacy.
1536. Thomas is 37 years old, has served in Bedchamber for 9 years, is considering retirement. His reforms are institutionalized. The simplified hygiene protocols are established practice. New servants are trained in health-based interpretation. The system operates well. Thomas has accomplished what he set out to do, has reformed how bedchamber service understands cleanliness, has made it more just, has left institutional legacy. He could retire satisfied. But Anne Boleyn's execution complicates everything. The Queen is accused of adultery and treason, is tried and beheaded. The court is in chaos again. New Queen will arrive soon, Jane Seymour. The bedchamber service will need to adjust to new mistress. Margaret's position is uncertain. The reforms Thomas and Margaret implemented might not survive regime change. New Queen might want different standards, might restore elaborate purification protocols, might reverse everything Thomas accomplished. That's always risk with institutional reform, that new leadership will undo progress. Thomas decides to stay, to help Margaret maintain simplified protocols through transition, to ensure reforms survive regime change, to fight for what they've built, even when it's threatened by new political reality. That's commitment, that's persistence, that's understanding that reform requires constant defense, not just initial achievement. That systems naturally drift back towards traditional practices, unless someone actively maintains changes. Thomas accepts responsibility for maintaining his reforms, for ensuring they persist beyond his initial advocacy, for defending them against attempts at restoration of old protocols. That's what successful reform requires, not just winning initial victory, but defending victory repeatedly against people who want to restore status quo. Thomas commits to this defense, stays in position, continues advocating, continues training, continues resisting attempts to restore elaborate hygiene.
Theatre. That commitment ensures reforms survive, ensures next generation inherit better system, ensures Thomas's work wasn't temporary disruption but permanent improvement.
Jane Seymour becomes queen, wants traditional elaborate protocols in her chambers, demands triple washing and perfumed water and fingernail inspections. Margaret must choose whether to implement these demands or resist them. She chooses resistance, explains to Jane that simplified protocols are current standard, that they've proven adequate for protecting health, that restoring elaborate rituals would be unnecessary regression. Jane is initially insistent. Margaret is persistent. Eventually Jane accepts simplified protocols, agrees to try them, finds they work fine, doesn't press for restoration of traditional elaborate requirements. That's Margaret's victory. That's defense of reforms through patient advocacy with new authority figure. Thomas supports Margaret through this negotiation, provides institutional backing, explains to household stewards that simplified protocols are established practice, that they have Lord Chamberlain's approval, that changing them would require formal decision, not just new Queen's preference, that bureaucratic resistance protects reforms, makes changing them difficult, requires justification and approval, creates inertia that favours maintaining current practice. Thomas uses this bureaucratic inertia strategically, makes defending reforms easier than reversing them. That's how institutional change persists, not through enthusiasm, but through becoming default practice, through requiring effort to change, through inertia. Thomas establishes simplified protocols as default, makes them bureaucratically entrenched, ensuring reversing them would require substantial effort and justification. That protection allows reforms to survive regime changes and changes in personnel.
That's sustainable reform, not dependent on individuals, but embedded in institutional practice. Thomas achieves this embedding, makes his reforms more than personal advocacy, makes them institutional standard. That's deep success. That's lasting change. That's what ensures
Reforms matter beyond Thomas's tenure.
1540. Thomas finally retires. He's 41 years old, has served in Bedchamber for 13 years, has spent last decade reforming hygiene protocols and defending those reforms, has successfully transformed how royal bedchamber understands cleanliness, has made that transformation permanent through institutional embedding, has trained 2 generations of servants in health-based interpretation of hygiene standards, has influenced multiple other courts to simplify their protocols, has partnered with Margaret to reform both King's and Queen's chambers, has defended reforms through multiple regime changes, has accomplished substantial institutional change from subordinate position. He retires satisfied, knowing his work matters, knowing it will persist, knowing he used his position to make systems slightly more just. That's good use of 13 years. That's meaningful service. That's something to be proud of. Thomas retires to small estate, lives quietly, dies in 1555 at age 56, is remembered by people who served with him as person who reformed bedchamber service, who made it more focused on health than theatre, who challenged dishonest justifications for class exclusion, who succeeded in making institution better. That's his legacy. Not famous, not historically significant, just person who saw injustice in system he maintained and worked successfully to reduce that injustice. That's what most good people accomplish. Not dramatic changes, but incremental improvements. Not revolution, but reform. Not perfection, but progress. Thomas's story is story of that kind of success. Ordinary servant recognizing ordinary injustice and working persistently to fix it. That's replicable. That's achievable. That's model for how individuals make systems better. See problem, understand problem, resist problem strategically, advocate for reform, win institutional support, implement change, defend change, embed change, train successors. That's the pattern Thomas followed. That's the
pattern that produced lasting reform. That pattern is available to anyone, in any institution, who recognizes injustice and commits to addressing it incrementally. That's the lesson. That's what hygiene rules around royal bedchamber reveal about changing habits and threats. That habits can be changed through persistent pressure from below. That threats to hierarchy can come from servants who refuse to maintain dishonest justifications for exclusion. That institutions can be reformed by people inside them who see flaws and work strategically to fix them. That's empowering message. That's hopeful conclusion. That's what Thomas's story teaches.
The hygiene protocols Thomas reformed continue evolving after his retirement. The next generation of servants further simplifies them, continues moving toward practical standards, continues away from elaborate rituals. By 1600, royal bedchamber hygiene looks completely different than it did in 1525. Simple hand-washing replaces triple purification. Regular clothes replace daily fresh garments. Practical cleanliness replaces symbolic purification. That transformation didn't happen automatically, happened because people like Thomas questioned protocols, advocated for reform, implemented changes, defended changes, embedded changes, trained successors who continued reforms. That's how institutional change works, through accumulated efforts of multiple people over multiple generations, each pushing systems slightly further toward justice. Thomas was part of that process, important part, not only part but essential part. His reforms made subsequent reforms possible. His success showed change was achievable. His methods provided template for others. That's how individuals matter in institutional change, not by doing everything alone, but by doing their part and enabling others to do theirs. Thomas did his part, did it well, did it successfully. That's sufficient. That's what makes his 13 years of service meaningful. That's what makes his story worth telling.
Not because he was exceptional, but because he was ordinary person who saw ordinary injustice and addressed it successfully through ordinary methods available to ordinary servants. That's replicable achievement. That's accessible model. That's proof that anyone can make systems better if they commit to doing so strategically and persistently. That's the lesson from hygiene rules that were stricter around bedchamber than hall. That those rules revealed hierarchy. That hierarchy could be challenged. That challenges could succeed. That success required strategy and persistence and coordination. That ordinary people in
Ordinary positions could accomplish extraordinary institutional reform through ordinary methods of questioning and advocacy and strategic resistance. That's Thomas's legacy. That's what his story teaches. That's why hygiene rules around royal bedchamber matter beyond their immediate context. They show how systems maintain hierarchy through dishonest justifications. They show how individuals can recognize dishonesty. They show how recognition can lead to resistance. They show how resistance can produce reform. They show how reform can persist and spread. They show how institutions change through accumulated efforts of people who refuse to maintain injustice unquestioningly. That's pattern that repeats across contexts. That's mechanism that works. That's how progress happens when individuals lack power to force change but possess power to advocate for change and eventually convince others that change serves genuine purposes better than maintaining status quo. That's what Thomas did. That's what hygiene rules reveal when examined carefully. That cleanliness can be about health or hierarchy. That choosing health over hierarchy is possible. That possibility can become reality through strategic effort. That reality can persist through institutional embedding. That persistence can influence broader culture. That's complete story of how hygiene rules around royal bedchamber changed habits and threats. Changed habits by reforming what cleanliness meant and how it was enforced. Changed threats by making hierarchy slightly less absolute, slightly more challengeable, slightly more dependent on honest justification rather than theatrical purification. Those changes matter. Small changes, insufficient changes, but changes nonetheless. Changes that made system better. Changes that came from below. Changes that succeeded against resistance. Changes that persisted beyond individuals who implemented them. Changes that proved institutional reform is possible, even for servants with
limited power. That's the lesson. That's the message. That's what Thomas Wardley's 13 years of service demonstrate. That anyone can question. That questioning can lead to understanding. That understanding can motivate resistance. That resistance can produce change. That change can matter. That's hopeful truth. That's accessible path. That's replicable achievement. That's what makes this story worth telling. That's what makes hygiene rules worth examining. That's what makes Thomas's ordinary service extraordinary in its ordinariness. He was just servant, doing his job, but he did it thoughtfully, questioned what he enforced, recognized injustice, resisted strategically, achieved reform. That's available to anyone. That's the real lesson, that ordinary people can make extraordinary difference through ordinary persistence in questioning ordinary injustice. That's Thomas. That's his story. That's what hygiene rules reveal when examined carefully by someone who understands that cleanliness is never just about contamination, but always also about power, and that power relationships can be challenged and reformed by people who commit to doing so strategically and persistently, regardless of their subordinate positions. That's the complete story. That's the resolution. That's what 13 years of service produced. Reform that persisted, change that mattered, improvement that proved possible. That's sufficient achievement. That's meaningful legacy. That's what makes Thomas Wardley's ordinary service worth remembering.